Hi, I'm Paco Nathan with O'Reilly Media, and it's a pleasure to be here today with a good friend, Susan Etlinger, also from the Bay Area.
Yep.
And you've been speaking here at the AI conference about AI and ethics.
Yeah. So I've been looking at the impact of artificial intelligence or autonomous technologies on business and society for quite some time now. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that when we think about this notion of ethics, which is all of a sudden becoming kind of more topical for people, we don't really have a good model for what it is. And I like to kind of think of ethics in a very simple way as norms of behavior, like norms of acceptable behavior in a society or a community. We don't and so we have that in the real world, in the physical world, the other world, the physical world. We may not always adhere to them, but we kind of know what they are. And yet in the digital space, like there are a lot of places that they're just completely novel interactions or novel experiences, and we don't really know how to navigate those.
Interesting. It's something alien.
Yeah.
But just even giving it the nomenclature and how can people, as adults, talk in groups, that seems like the first best step.
Yeah, although, it's funny, when I started writing about this, I felt like I needed to sort of hide it under the vegetables, or hide the vegetables under the, main course kind of thing. And so I started talking about artificial intelligence ethics as an element of the customer experience. Because when you're talking to people in the enterprise, you're talking business people, marketers, or strategy people, or product people, they really think about the customer experience. They don't really have a model for thinking about ethics. It just has, you think, oh, well, maybe that's compliance, or that's legal, or that's like a PR issue that we have to deal with. But they don't necessarily think about ethics in the way that it affects the customer per se. And so I felt like that was a useful construct to at least start the conversation. But I kind of feel like, now, I don't know, 2 or so years into that, it's time to come out of the closet and talk about ethics and just say, okay, unapologetically, we actually need to talk about digital ethics.
Serve the raw vegetables as a crudité.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's okay to be a vegan now.
Lee, you had a tweet thread recently. There's one that's pinned on Twitter that goes into excellent detail, and I like there was a lot of interaction on that too. Could you describe more some of, I guess, what are the starting points or what are the issues that we're running into? Yeah,
so the thread actually I have to apologize to and also thank Kathy Smith, who wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, because she kind of started that thread. And essentially what had happened was she wrote this book called Weapons of Math Destruction, which is about the ways in which algorithms can lead to disenfranchisement of people in healthcare and the criminal justice system and financial services and things like that. And one day she made a comment that I think she didn't intend it the way it was taken, which was that academia has been sort of, on its heels about this issue of AI ethics and really needs to take a stronger stand. And so a lot of academics were not very pleased with that comment and felt that, and sort of piled on and started passing around lists of people in academia who are working on different ethics issues related to bias and discrimination and other things. And so I thought it was a good a useful kind of moment to start talking about what's happening in industry, because while I work in business and I'm essentially a business-focused person, I do look at a lot of the academic papers and try to understand what's happening in academia. So I started thinking about kind of what are some of the issues we need to be thinking and talking about as business people. Given that algorithms have an impact in society, it's not necessarily an easy leap to think about what happens in a recommendation engine, what happens in a personalization algorithm or a translation algorithm or natural language tool, or speech detection like in Alexa, or chatbots, voice agents, and those sorts of things. And so I wanted to say, it's important not only for us to deal with this societally, but that businesses actually need to start thinking about the value chain of data and also kind of the implications of autonomous and self-learning technologies on the way that they deliver products and services, and ultimately the impact on individual people who receive those products and services.
And really, also, are you focusing or pointing that focus toward the use cases? Here are the actual business line use cases
absolutely.
Your customers interact with all day, every day.
Absolutely. So if you're doing audience segmentation, and you understand, for example, that like one of the big issues around algorithmic bias has to do with language and the way that the Word2Vec data set, which is used to train natural language algorithms, is used, it includes and it contains a lot of intrinsic bias. And there's a paper written by a couple of researchers at Microsoft and Boston University that's about 2 years old now. That's sort of the original text in some ways of a lot of this discussion. And that's important from a societal perspective. But like when you think about it, it's feeding into audience segmentation. It's feeding into any kind of conversational business technologies that you're using, whether they're chat or voice. It's feeding into lots of other things. And so I wanted kind of business people to be thinking about, gosh, if we're doing this, like, we don't want obviously to be creating racist products and services or sexist or in some way dehumanizing our customers. We need to understand the ways that this stuff works and actually start to understand some of the ways in which people are trying to remediate it so that we can ensure that we're not inadvertently doing things that end up disenfranchising or alienating people and breaking trust with us.
Interesting. So there's actually a long supply chain, if you will, or a long pipeline leading up to the decisions that are made automatically, and organizations could be sort of undermining their last mile efforts.
That's right.
If they're not doing the right work
That's
to
right.
prepare their data.
That's right. And some of these are known issues and some of these are not known issues, or they're known in some communities and not known in others. So like one simple example would be, and actually Kathy Smith I think has given this example, like if you were to create an algorithm to hire people for, at a big, let's say a big tech company, like a multi-billion-dollar tech company, and you wanted to look for all the attributes of the most successful employees. So you look at tenure and you look at level and you look at performance evaluations and maybe you look at compensation or promotion, consistent promotion history. You're going to find a lot of those people, shockingly, kind of look the same, are of the same gender, are in a pretty narrow age range. And so there's a pattern matching thing that is done. And algorithms are not, they're not intuitive, right? If you tell them, look for success, it will define success in the ways that it sees. It will not infer that, women have left, the company for one reason or another, or weren't hired in, or people of color weren't.
Right, that'll be external.
It won't.
Yeah.
It doesn't understand those
Yeah.
externalities, and so you end up actually. Kind of intensifying and amplifying the bias that existed in the beginning by training that algorithm with the data that you already have. And I think while a data scientist sort of innately understands that, your average business person, not that there isn't average, but most business people don't necessarily know that. So I think it's important for us to flip the switch so that they walk into a meeting and they have that in the back of their mind and they start asking those probing questions about, can we ensure that we're not inadvertently kind of missing groups of our customer base or our desired customer base or addressable market because we just don't have, rich enough data or we don't have the right data.
There was another Twitter thread this morning, I think probably someone who's a mutual friend of ours. If not, we'll make an introduction right away today. But James Chems was talking about how supervised machine learning is inherently promoting the status quo because we're always looking behind
Yes.
and projecting in the future. So there's sort of an inherent reactionary aspect of supervised learning models.
Yes.
And that's a bias in itself.
That's right.
From the get-go.
That's right. That's right. I mean, if you, at the simplest level, if you say, there are two categories of fruit, apples and bananas, you show it a, Volkswagen, and it's an apple or a banana.
Yeah.
And so, so I think one of the challenges that we're facing in all of this, which has absolutely nothing to do with technology, is that most of us think about artificial intelligence. Most of us who are not data scientists, who are not engineers, think of artificial intelligence in this way that's been culturally constructed for us by, the media, popular culture, movies, Skynet. What's the over/under on how long it takes for an AI conversation to get to Skynet? It's like a new Godwin's law or something, right? Killer robots, the trolley problem, all of these things, the singularity, all of these things kind of pop up, and yet the issues that that artificial intelligence kind of raises are not necessarily, at least not at this point, those big existential issues about when the robots will take us over, but they're the issues about how do we ensure that people of color are not disproportionately incarcerated, or have enough medical care, or that we don't deny mortgage loans to young people, to young women, because they lack a certain pattern matching capability that older men do. You know, those types of things.
We were talking a little bit earlier, and one of the things I was learning from you about this is, you know, people making decisions out in business understand risk. They do that every day, and when we're talking about ethics, it's not like it's something completely new. We make these decisions in our lives,
right.
And there's probably no perfect choice. We're going to have to make tough decisions at some point, but it's better to know it in advance than it is to be surprised by it. So could you describe how that kind of revisit some of our discussion about, you know, how do you really take a educated approach to
Yeah, I mean, you know, here's the thing. Part of the challenge with the word ethics is that it does have this connotation of some, you know, sage bearded person wagging his finger at you, you know, and telling you how to live. And that's really not my intention. Like, you know, if you think about something as simple as Amazon rolling out its same-day delivery service. So they roll out their same-day delivery service, and you know, if you want to build an algorithm to say, where should we put that little warehouse to ensure that we can get the right, you know, where should we put them to make sure that we can do same-day delivery to the greatest number of people with all these attributes, who spend a certain amount of money, who have whatever, have certain shopping behaviors, and then you cluster them around a city or you cluster them around a major metropolitan area. You know, what ended up happening was that in this construct, same-day delivery was not available to, you know, lower income communities and communities of color. And one of the things, you know, that obviously that race is correlated with is zip code. And the reverse as well, zip code is correlated with race, right? And so if you say, well, we're going to use these zip codes and that's our proxy for how we're going to distribute this, you end up in this situation where they had all those, you know, news headlines that said, you know, same-day Amazon's racist because they're not offering same-day delivery to communities of people of color. Now, was that Amazon's intention? I don't speak for Amazon, I don't, you know, but there was a business decision about where we should put these things. There may or may not have been a discussion about what is the secondary implication. Secondary kind of is the wrong word, but what's another implication of that? And, you know, another implication of that is that now we've actually created this sort of, what do they call them? You know, like food desert. You know,
right,
like this kind of delivery
exactly,
desert
all
for
over
people.
again.
And so now we've essentially created a situation in which a group of people is kind of feeling like second-class citizens because they're not getting the same services that their, you know, counterparts in other zip codes are getting. And so all I'm saying here is that yes, there's a very complex, you know, series of interactions between data science and product development. And ultimately, though, business decision making, because some of these things end up becoming business decisions. And I think it's important to make those decisions knowing what the issues are, as opposed to not knowing what the issues are. And I may agree or disagree, think it's right or wrong, that's my personal thing, but, you know, I don't get to choose.
Well, you know, it does, from my perspective, it seems like businesses came into being data-driven and adopting data science, really looking at just 1 or 2 KPIs per use case. So it's a very simple view of optimizing. And now across the board, they're finding out that's really not good.
Right.
And it may not be the secondary or tertiary or whatever, but it's not a simple thing to optimize. You can't just have a product manager screaming about one API. You have to take a look at a lot of trade-offs.
That's right.
But that's getting elevated more. I mean, that's becoming more of an executive decision. It's not just
Yes.
a product manager decision.
Yes, and I think that this actually makes me quite happy because I feel as though there are a couple of different things that are happening at the same time. One is people like Avinash Kaushik at Google have been talking about, you know, the danger of a single KPI or the danger of a single metric for a long time. Like if you read his blog, he's been talking about this for a long time. And then the Nigerian author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, wrote this book called Americana and a couple of other books. And she's also done a TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story, in which she talks about the dangers that we take on as a society when we kind of put people into kind of a single story, a story of overcoming poverty or a story of overcoming adversity, and not kind of think about their full humanity. So when we think about metrics and optimizing for engagement, just revenue. We have to think about what happens, what's the trade-off there. You know, there's that old thought experiment about what happens if you train an algorithm to turn, you know, to create paper clips, and then it ends up destroying, you know, cars in the whole world just, you know, to make the paper clips. You know, that's sort of the same level of thinking, I think. So the second piece is, it makes me, I think it's very important, first of all, to have these conversations to try to educate people about what some of those trade-offs are, and then it's natural for the executives to walk into a room and have those conversations at least in an informed way. As opposed to like worrying about when the robots are coming to kill us, which is like, by the way, Thursday at 7. Just in case you're wondering.
I can't beat that.
GMT.
Okay. I'll have to adjust my phone. I'm curious about like, where's the state of things right now? I've definitely seen, you know, notable people doing series of articles and essays. There's a great one. One of our mutual friends, Mike Lukides, is working with Hillary Mason, DJ Patil. They came out with a great series this summer. And there's other groups that are starting to produce checklists and make them GitHub friendly, so that if, as you're launching a project, include this along. But you know, what are some of the next steps? I mean, where does this roll out? What does it meet the code?
So we're in this sort of super nascent place, right, where people are just starting to talk about ethics. I'm starting to see on LinkedIn people are like calling themselves like AI ethicists, which always freaks me out, unless you're really a philosopher and a data scientist, like together. But so the interesting things are happening. So principles are coming out. Like a lot of businesses are starting to publish principles. I saw Keith Bigelow from GE published a piece, a blog post not too long, GE Healthcare published a piece on principles. Insurance company AXA has published some principles. Different companies, DJ and Mike and Hillary Mason published some checklists. So there's different things starting to happen. I think at the first level, it's principles. What are we going to adhere to? What are we going to, you know, what are going to be our driving values?
Get that up front.
Is it a value of inclusion? Like, and should we ensure, you know, that we prioritize our customers' dignity, or our customers' feeling of self-worth, or positive experience, along with revenue generation, and how do we handle that trade-off? So principles first, and then practices, right? So what are we going to do in our research? What are we going to do in our engineering? What are we going to do in our product development processes, our go-to-market strategies, our communications, to infuse and in our user interface design, to infuse all those things as much as possible. And then how are we going to govern those? So right now, there are little sparkles of things happening at all these different levels. There are principles coming out. There are, AI Now has published an algorithmic impact assessment for public agencies, which I think could very, you know, I wouldn't say easily, but could be very interestingly transformed into something that industry could use, that businesses could use.
Oh, that's a fantastic group, Meredith Whitaker
and Kate Crawford and those folks. They're brilliant. And then IBM has been doing some interesting work around trying to show bias checks and a supplier declaration of conformity. So basically to say, you know, toolkits essentially to bring partners on board and say, you know, we want to use ethical data principles, and we want to use ethical algorithms, and we want to ensure that you do that as well, so that we don't end up in a situation in which we've got issues that we don't know about. We're seeing much more education and evangelism happen, so stuff like this, right, where we talk about it. Data, and then a company called Dion has published a checklist for data scientists. But one thing I do want to stress, so there's a woman at Salesforce named Kathy Baxter, who's a kind of an AI ethics and user experience expert. And she said something at Dreamforce that I thought was really important. She said, you know, ethics isn't a checklist, it's a mindset. And I think, you know, so at the top we have this sort of mindset and slow, I wouldn't call it culture change, but evolution of reasonable discussions about ethics. And then underneath that we have kind of principles, practices, and then kind of governance. And there are pieces that are happening in all of those areas, but no real cohesive framework as of yet.
Would it be fair to say that ethics is a team sport?
Oh yeah, it has to be, right? Because you need the data scientist who understands the data. You need the business stakeholder who understands the requirements of the business. You need engineers who know what can be productized, operations people who know what can work. You need to be able to figure out if the, you know, computation and you know, just if computation actually makes sense. You need to have people who can bring that to market and explain it. You need to have compliance and legal. You need to, like, all these different employees need to be on board. I mean, this is all over the enterprise.
And I mean, Silicon Valley people love to debate about full stack and use the word unicorn, but this is ultimate. This is an ultimate in terms of full stack, because it goes all the way from the base of where you're collecting your data out to how your customers are interacting. It's encompassing not just technology, but also all the business. Yeah. And realistically, if it's not done right, the question is, will you have customers and employees left over?
Yeah. So imagine, imagine today, when I used to, like 18 months ago, started doing these kinds of talks, or 2 years ago, I'd say, raise your hand if you've interacted with AI today. When I was talking to business audiences, like a few hands would go up. And I'm like, okay, so raise your hand if you use Google, raise your hand if you're on Facebook, if you're on Twitter, raise your hand if you texted somebody with predictive text, raise your hand, and then all of a sudden all the hands are up. I'm like, everybody's interacting with AI. I don't have to do that anymore. Yeah. And so now what's happening is that, in terms of full stack, people have an understanding that algorithms are influencing our lives, but we're in 2018. In 5 years, in 10 years, imagine how many products and services are going to be fully digital, right? Now, companies like Procter & Gamble with the Olay Skin Advisor, like, that's a purely digital product for like a 100-plus-year-old company. Imagine now all these companies with digital products and services. And so the more that happens, the more digital interactions we have, the more we need norms of behavior that actually support digital interactions so that we are delivering experiences that we want in digital spaces. We know how to do that, say overall, right, in manufacturing and actual physical products that you can hold in your hand. You know how to publish a book, you know how to make a car, you know how to deal with safety. Now we have to do all those things except in digital.
And one of the stories coming out of the conference, of a few videos we've done earlier today, is just how much of the machine learning is moving out into the field, into the edge, small embedded devices where in some cases there's already billions of them out there waiting to be programmed, and now very convenient ways for any developer to pop up and write something in Python and deploy it. But those things are really autonomous and they're everywhere. And it could be like, every coffee machine and every door, anything that you interact with has something in there with machine learning models interacting. Yep. All for potentials for really bad cases of this done wrong.
Yeah, if we don't think it through. We just bought it at home. We just bought a new dishwasher, and I get home and I'm like, oh my God, like there's Wi-Fi.
I know. Seriously.
What data are you collecting? What are you doing with it? Are you learning something? Like, I want to know. Right. And so, yes, there are tremendous opportunities for risk. I will say though that one of the things I think is the most interesting is not necessarily approaching everything as risk mitigation.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah.
Right? And I think risk mitigation clearly is important. But here's a thought experiment for you. What happens if we can remove or mitigate or remediate bias? What happens if we can figure out the interplay between precision and recall, or we can optimize models to truly understand those trade-offs, make decisions, consider decisions? What new products, services, business models, experiences, revenue streams can we actually create once we do that? One great example is around skin cancer. And there was a wonderful article in The Atlantic not too long ago that talked about the fact that physicians typically are not very good at diagnosing skin cancer in people of color. There's a lower incidence, but there's higher mortality, and maybe that, I don't, I'm not a physician, but I think it has to do with later diagnosis, and maybe there's some different kinds of variations and things like that. But, so you imagine that that's happening in the physical world, and then when you translate that to an algorithm, imagine how thin that data set is around skin cancer, what a lesion looks like in somebody who has, skin darker than a Caucasian person. And then, what was interesting about it was the physician who was being interviewed said, I don't think AI is bad. I actually think, we're out there trying to get a data set from, from some other countries, like in Africa and in South India, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, to try to ensure that we have enough data that we can now start to better understand the characteristics, the attributes of skin cancer lesions in a range, in everybody. And once we do that, we have the ability to deliver low-cost digital diagnostic services to any community around the world. And that's amazing, right? Because you go from a place of want and of kind of discrimination or disenfranchisement that literally has mortal consequences to a place where now you can actually go out and save lives because you flipped the script by simply knowing that you had a data issue, by addressing that data issue. Now, I'm not saying it's all fixed, right? But the idea is, what happens if you flip that script and you say, if we were to solve this, what would then be possible? That's where I think all the innovation potential lies.
So that's the larger narrative that we really need to be using as a pattern.
Absolutely.
When we're trying to say, let's have AI adoption in enterprise. Let's not just stop at the quick fix. Let's actually look at making this better.
Right. And if you want to look at a model for this, look at how we dealt with GDPR in May.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's great.
So it's a miserable experience, right? It's a miserable experience. Now, I will say that the intent behind GDPR, which comes out of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the intent is to give people control of their data and to essentially enable people to make decisions based on their data that affect their rights and their safety. That's a beautiful thing. What did it mean in practice? A whole lot of really, really annoying emails and websites we couldn't reach. So yes, there's always that first very clunky, ugly implementation that everybody hates, and we're in that phase right now of ugly, clunky stuff. But one of the things that I think is kind of the bright spot here is a comment that Richard Socher made actually at Dreamforce, where he talked about the beginnings of the invention of the internal combustion engine. And the comment that he made was, if you go back to the beginning of the internal combustion engine, if people had had a conversation about what are the downstream implications of all this coal use, of all of this, drilling for oil, imagine that this technology now proliferates around the entire world and that the population increases, what will it look like in 10, 20, or 50 years? And that could have changed where we are today in terms of environmental sustainability. And so his point was that this is kind of where we are with AI, and we're having this conversation now. And I think that's a really important way of looking at this, that number one, it's not just about risk mitigation, it's about opportunity creation. And number two, we're at the beginning. So this is our responsibility. The onus is on us to have harder conversations about awkward things so that we can ensure that the next generation isn't living with, essentially a toxic digital environment.
Yeah, generational impact. That makes so much sense. The automobiles started 4 generations ago, and now we're having to make drastic changes.
It's obvious now, right? But it wasn't obvious then.
Very good. Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.